Some dinners quietly break lifelong bonds. My brother did not forbid me from attending his engagement. He just demanded something colder: do not tell anyone you are my sister. Banished to a table by the kitchen doors, I watched him charm the wealthy guests, but Grant made one fatal miscalculation. His fiancée's powerful father already knew me and owed me a massive debt. Grant hid me because my identity would shatter his entire fabricated empire. My name is Sarah Crosby. I stood in the doorway of my cramped Atlanta apartment, the distinct smell of pulverized concrete and stale coffee clinging stubbornly to my high-visibility jacket. It had been a grueling 13-hour shift inspecting the skeletal remains of a compromised commercial mid-rise in the downtown sector. My right leg was screaming. The dull, familiar ache throbbed in perfect rhythm with my elevated pulse. I tossed my heavy keyring onto the scratched wooden counter. The metal hit the surface with a sharp clatter that echoed violently in the small, quiet room. Before I could even bend down to unlace my steel-toed work boots, my cell phone vibrated aggressively against the granite island. The bright screen lit up the dim kitchen, displaying a name I had not seen on caller ID in over 7 months: Grant Crosby, my older brother. Grant only ever called when he needed something extracted from me. A quick signature on a joint tax document, a tedious favor regarding our parents' estate planning, or a free structural consultation he could easily pass off as his own brilliant insight at his high-end urban development firm. Still, against my better judgment, I slid my thumb across the screen and answered, "Sarah." His voice came through the speaker. It was smooth, highly polished, the auditory equivalent of a tailored Italian suit. "I managed to catch you at home. You caught me trying to take my boots off," I said, leaning my weight against the counter and rubbing my stiff thigh. "What is going on?" "Grant, I have some significant news," he announced, his tone carrying a practiced, heavy weight. "I'm getting engaged. To Amelia Mercer." I blinked, the dense fog of physical exhaustion momentarily lifting from my brain. Amelia Mercer. Even I, a woman who spent her days buried in technical blueprints and covered in construction dust, knew exactly who that was. Her father was Senator Warren Mercer, a towering political figure currently painting the entire state of Georgia with his specific brand of flawless, traditional, high society politics. For a brief, incredibly naive second, a genuine smile touched my face. My brother was getting married. He was personally calling to tell me the news. He actually wanted me involved in a major life milestone. "Grant, that is wonderful," I said, my defensive guard dropping completely. "Congratulations. Truly, I am happy for you." "Thank you," he replied swiftly, clipping the sentiment short. "We are hosting an intimate engagement dinner this coming Saturday. It will be at the Mercer Estate on Skidaway Island. I expect you to make an appearance." I felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth bloom in my chest. After several long years of maintaining a polite, sterile distance, of him expertly navigating the elite, moneyed circles of Calder Row advisory while I waded through urban decay, he was finally pulling me back into the family fold. "Just send me the exact details," I told him. "I will make the drive down. There is just one minor technicality we need to clear up before you formally RSVP," Grant continued. The warmth in his voice was abruptly replaced by the sterile, absolute chill of a corporate boardroom negotiation, a technicality I echoed, my brow furrowing. "Yes, you are welcome to attend the dinner. I want you in the room. But under no circumstances are you to introduce yourself as my sister." The silence that followed his command was absolute and deafening. The low hum of my aging refrigerator suddenly sounded like a roaring freight train. My hand tightened around the plastic casing of the phone. The slow, creeping sensation of being physically slapped settled over my skin, leaving a burning trail in its wake. "Excuse me," I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly quiet. "Do not make this difficult, Sarah." He sighed aloud. The sound was steeped in pure condescension. "If anyone approaches you and asks, you are simply an old family friend, a distant colleague of mother's. Keep your answers vague, keep your interactions brief, and do not attempt to mingle with the primary tables. You are formally inviting me to your engagement dinner. I articulated every single word as if I were cutting glass with my tongue, and demanding I completely erase my own bloodline at the front door. It is strictly a matter of optics, he stated, completely unfazed by my rising anger. The Mercer family is incredibly traditional. Senator Mercer is running a very tight ship regarding his public image right now. The guest list is heavily curated. We have major political donors, senior campaign advisors, and highly influential real estate developers attending. Every single detail needs to be perfectly clean. We absolutely cannot afford any unpredictable variables walking around the dining room. Unpredictable variables. I repeated. The coldness was rapidly spreading from my chest to my extremities. Exactly what do I dirty up? Grant, he did not answer the question immediately. When he finally spoke, he used that infuriatingly slick, lawyerly cadence specifically designed to evade direct hits while inflicting maximum damage. You have a very specific, aggressive energy. Sarah, you are excessively blunt. Your chosen profession is inherently rough and working class. You continuously show up to formal family events in a 10-year-old gray sedan that actively leaks oil onto the pavement. And frankly, with your past leg injury, the way you walk sometimes, the limp, it draws the wrong kind of sympathetic attention. It inevitably invites probing questions I simply do not have the time or desire to manage. This Saturday night is about projecting total stability and a flawless family pedigree. I stood frozen against my kitchen counter, listening to him meticulously list my flaws. I felt as if the room had tilted beneath my feet. The whole conversation was so cruelly polished, so theatrically calculated, that it barely sounded real, but it was real. This was my actual brother, calmly stripping me of my identity because I did not fit the image he wanted to sell. You are deeply ashamed of me, I stated flatly, stripping away the corporate jargon to expose the ugly truth. I am managing a highly delicate social and financial merger, he corrected smoothly, entirely missing the basic humanity of my statement. And before you start launching into a self-righteous crusade about family loyalty, you should know I already discussed this exact protocol with Mom and Dad. They fully understand the high stakes involved. They agreed this arrangement is the most logical and beneficial path forward for everyone. That was the true knife in the ribs. He slid the blade in and twisted it with absolute, terrifying precision. My parents knew. They had sat in the comfort of their pristine suburban living room and collectively agreed that their 35-year-old daughter's existence was a public relations liability. They had willingly consented to my social erasure just to ensure Grant's perfectly smooth transition into the upper echelons of Savannah society. My own mother and father preferred a convenient lie over my presence. My very first instinct was to violently end the call, to tell him to take his high society dinner, his wealthy fiancée, and his curated guest list, and choke on them. I wanted to scream into the receiver, to throw my phone against the cracked plaster wall until it shattered into 100 pieces. I wanted to fiercely refuse him the sick satisfaction of my quiet compliance. I wanted to stay in Atlanta and let them play their pretend game without me. But then, the deeply ingrained instinct of a seasoned structural safety investigator aggressively kicked in. Over the years, I had learned one absolute truth when someone goes to such extreme, highly unnatural lengths to cover a detail up. It is never just about superficial aesthetics. Grant was undeniably arrogant and obsessed with status. Yes, but he was also deeply, ruthlessly calculating. He was entirely too smart to risk provoking a chaotic scene just because my car was old or my dress lacked a recognized designer label. His fake, manufactured calmness, his desperate need to tightly control my exact physical placement in that specific room, felt exactly like a massive structural anomaly. It was the human equivalent of a freshly painted load-bearing wall, hiding a massive, fatal crack in the foundation. If I stayed home in Atlanta, I would just be the bitter, rejected sister sulking in the shadows. He would win. The lie would hold. But if I drove down there, sat exactly where he placed me at the back of the room, and simply watched the architecture of his new life Saturday, I finally said, I forced my voice to be completely flat, totally stripped of any recognizable emotion or hurt. "Excellent," Grant replied immediately. His intense relief was thinly veiled as brotherly approval. "I will email you the security gate code tonight. Dress appropriately. Please. Dark, muted colors. Nothing loud or distracting. I will see you there. Grant." I ended the call before he could offer even one more piece of degrading, micromanaged advice. I stood completely alone in my quiet kitchen for a very long time, staring blankly at the dark screen of my phone. I was going to this elaborate dinner. I was not going out of some desperate, lingering hope for familial love, and I was certainly not going to play the obedient, silent ghost he desperately wanted me to be. I was going because my sharpest professional gut instinct told me that a massive room full of powerful people so desperately trying to look perfectly clean was bound to be hiding something incredibly, dangerously dirty. And I was going to sit in the dark, wait for the cracks to show, and find out exactly what it was. For my entire life, the Crosby family had a designated phrase for my personality. They called me difficult to integrate. It was a polite, highly sanitized way of saying I lacked the genetic predisposition for strategic pretending. I never learned how to nod enthusiastically at terrible ideas, or how to laugh at aggressively unfunny jokes just because the person telling them had a massive net worth. I lived completely alone in a strictly functional space, excelled at a job that required absolute brutal honesty, and spent exactly 0 minutes a day agonizing over my personal brand. Grant, conversely, was the undisputed golden child of our bloodline. He was the ultimate return on investment my parents had always dreamed of producing. He possessed a degree from a top-tier law school and a massive corner office at Calder Rowe Advisory. Calder Rowe was an elite urban development consulting firm. They did not pour concrete or weld steel. They sold glossy, multi-million-dollar visions of the future to city councils and wealthy investors. Grant did not just walk into rooms. He calculated their exact social gravity and floated effortlessly to the highest point of influence. He knew exactly which hands to shake, which names to drop, and how to weaponize a charming, perfectly asymmetrical smile. My world was built on a much harsher, much dirtier reality. I wore practical, heavy-duty clothes, specifically designed to withstand violent friction and unpredictable weather. My daily schedule was dictated by emergency structural alerts and catastrophic material failures. My career was permanently dusted with pulverized concrete, bound by massive technical files, and steeped in the rigid laws of physics. More importantly, my job required me to make unilateral, unforgiving decisions that routinely cost extremely wealthy men millions of dollars. When a foundation was compromised, or a load-bearing column showed signs of shear stress, I did not negotiate timelines. I shut the site down immediately. That fundamental difference between us, Grant facilitating the lofty ambitions of the elite, while I actively audited their physical safety, had always been a quiet, bitter battleground. The evening after Grant dropped his mandate, my phone rang again. This time, the bright screen displayed my mother's name. Elaine Crosby possessed a voice that sounded like expensive velvet wrapped tightly around a steel wire. "Sarah, darling," she began, completely bypassing any standard greeting. "I spoke with your brother this afternoon. He mentioned your conversation regarding the engagement dinner on Saturday." I set down the plastic dry cleaning bag containing the single formal dress I owned. "He gave me a very clear, very specific set of rules, Mom. He told me to pretend I am not his sister." My mother let out a soft, highly practiced sigh over the receiver. It was the exact noise she always made when a waiter brought the wrong vintage of wine to the table. "Oh, Sarah, you are phrasing it so dramatically. Grant is simply asking you to be flexible for one single night. He is stepping into a very complex, highly visible family. The Mercers are practically political royalty in this state. Everything needs to go absolutely smoothly. You know how you get sometimes. You can be a bit rigid." "Rigid," I repeated. The word tasted exactly like cold ash in my mouth. "You mean I do not lie well?" "I mean you lack a certain social agility," she corrected smoothly, her tone completely devoid of maternal warmth. We are just asking you to play a supportive, quiet role. Grant has worked his entire life for an opportunity exactly like this. Do not make this weekend about your ego. Just drive down, smile, have a glass of champagne, and let your brother shine. We need you to be a team player for the family." She hung up shortly after that, leaving me standing in the center of my kitchen with the distinct, heavy sensation of being professionally managed. She did not ask how my week was going. She did not ask if my bad leg was bothering me after a long shift. Her only concern was ensuring I did not accidentally scuff the shiny, expensive veneer of her son's impending marriage. My father, Thomas Crosby, did not even bother to call me. He was a man who communicated primarily through financial ledgers and cold risk assessments. At precisely 8 o'clock that night, my screen lit up with a single, sterile text message from him. It read, "Do not make things more tense than necessary." 10 words. That was the absolute entirety of his paternal guidance. A direct, unapologetic order to absorb the insult, pack my bags, and remain completely invisible. I walked into my bedroom and stood in front of my narrow closet, pushing aside heavy flannel shirts and stiff canvas work trousers. Tucked in the very back was a simple, unadorned black dress. I had purchased it 3 years ago for a regional professional engineering award ceremony. It was not haute couture. It was not cut from imported Italian silk or stitched by a renowned European designer. It was purely practical, designed to blend into the background. I pulled it off the wooden hanger and laid it carefully across my neatly made bed. I stared at the dark, matte fabric, feeling the familiar bone-deep exhaustion of a person who had spent 35 years being ranked second. I was not losing any sleep over the dress itself. I did not care if my practical leather heels lacked a famous red sole, or if my hair was not professionally styled at a salon. My anxiety stemmed from a much deeper, much darker place. I wondered if my mere physical presence in that extravagant coastal mansion would be treated like a glaring, offensive stain on a pristine white tablecloth. As I stood there in the quiet, dusty isolation of my apartment, my mind involuntarily cycled through a heavy, exhausting catalog of memories. I recalled every single time Grant had looked at me and seen nothing but a collection of deeply unsuitable traits. He absolutely hated my bluntness. He despised my stubborn refusal to play standard office politics or laugh at corporate jokes. Above all, he hated that I was the exact kind of person who would violently flip a game board and ruin the entire evening the second I realized someone was hiding a dangerous flaw. To Grant, truth was a highly negotiable currency used to buy leverage. To me, truth was the only thing keeping a 50-story commercial building from pancaking into the earth and burying hundreds of people. So why exactly was I packing a travel bag? Why was I planning to fuel up my leaky, 10-year-old gray sedan to drive several hundred miles down to the coast, just to be publicly humiliated by my own flesh and blood? The answer was not born of unconditional love, and it certainly was not born of pathetic submission. I was going because the very nature of Grant's bizarre demand was fundamentally flawed. You do not force your sister to attend a major life event and simultaneously strip her of her actual name unless her name itself is an active, dangerous threat. You do not painstakingly orchestrate her physical seating arrangement at a dining table unless you are absolutely terrified of who she might casually speak to over the appetizers. They aggressively wanted me silent. They wanted me to be a perfectly compliant, invisible ghost hovering at the absolute edge of the room. I decided right then, staring down at that plain black dress, that I would give them exactly what they asked for. I would go to the island. I would keep my mouth securely shut. I would not introduce myself as a Crosby to a single soul. I would fade entirely into the background and watch the wealthy and the powerful clink their expensive crystal glasses. But my silence would not be the harmless, obedient surrender they all expected. It would be the heavy, calculating silence of a senior inspector walking onto a condemned construction site. I would observe every single interaction, measure the tension in every forced smile, and calculate the exact structural integrity of Grant's brand new, flawless life. If that engagement dinner party was going to detonate, and my professional instincts screamed loudly that it would, the initial spark would not come from my mouth. The fire would be started by the dark, heavy secrets those people were confidently carrying right into the dining room. All I had to do was take my assigned seat at the very back, blend into the shadows, and wait for the foundation to finally crack. The transition from the humid Georgia highway to the private, gated enclave of Skidaway Island felt like crossing a heavily guarded border into a different reality. The air itself seemed filtered. Ancient oak trees, thick with Spanish moss, lined the winding coastal road, illuminated by perfectly spaced, warm amber uplighting. It was a landscape meticulously engineered to guarantee that chaos, dirt, or failure had never been allowed to take root here. Every blade of grass looked as though it had been individually trimmed with surgical scissors. I navigated my faded, 10-year-old gray sedan up the sweeping, crushed-shell driveway of the Mercer family estate. The house was a massive, sprawling coastal mansion with white columns and wide verandas, glowing against the darkening Atlantic sky. As I pulled into the valet line, my car coughed loudly, a harsh mechanical rattle that cut through the soft, ambient classical music drifting from the open French doors. I parked directly between a pristine black imported sports car and a massive luxury SUV that gleamed like wet ink. My vehicle looked like a piece of industrial debris accidentally dropped into a high-end promotional photograph advertising upper-class supremacy. The young valet, dressed in a spotless white uniform and a black bow tie, approached my window. He paused for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting to the cracked trim on my passenger door, clearly recalibrating his protocol for a lost delivery driver. When I handed him my keys, I could feel the cold, heavy weight of class separation settling over the evening. I did not even make it to the grand mahogany double doors before the first perimeter defense intercepted me. Grant stepped out from the shadows of a massive stone planter, physically blocking my path to the entrance. He was not there to welcome me. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that fit him with the precision of architectural armor. The fabric was darker than the night sky, and the cut screamed of wealth that did not need to announce its price tag. "You are right on time," he murmured, his voice a low, urgent hiss. He grabbed my upper arm, not with affection, but with the firm, controlling grip of a security detail neutralizing a potential threat. "Let go of my arm, Grant," I said quietly, looking down at his manicured fingers against my black fabric. He released me, taking a half-step back, his eyes frantically scanning the brilliantly lit foyer behind him to ensure no one was watching us. "We are going to review the protocol one final time before you walk into that room. You do not address me as your brother under any circumstances. You do not discuss our childhood, our parents, or your specific line of work. If you are cornered, you are an old acquaintance of Elaine. You keep your head down, you eat your dinner, and you do not initiate conversations with the primary guests." "I understand the terms of my surrender," I replied, my tone entirely flat. "You do not need to repeat the script. Just execute it flawlessly," he demanded. Before he could issue another warning, the heavy wooden doors swung wider, spilling golden light onto the stone porch. A woman stepped out, and the entire atmosphere around my brother instantly shifted from hostile command to nervous deference. This was Amelia Mercer. I had mentally prepared myself for a specific archetype, a cold, heavily styled heiress dripping with aristocratic condescension and inherited arrogance. I was entirely wrong. Amelia was striking, but in an intelligent, grounded way. She wore a deep emerald gown that flowed with understated elegance, free of needless ruffles or gaudy sequins. Her posture was relaxed but commanding. But it was her eyes that caught me completely off guard. They were incredibly sharp. She scanned the porch, taking in Grant's rigid shoulders and my defensive stance, and I could practically see her brain processing the mismatched data points. "Grant, you abandoned me during the ambassador's toast," she said, her voice rich and melodic, yet carrying an undeniable edge of authority. Then, she turned her full attention to me. She did not look at my plain dress or my scuffed practical heels. She looked directly into my eyes. "You must be Sarah," Amelia said, stepping forward and extending her hand. "Grant told me you were an old friend of his mother. I am Amelia. It is incredibly kind of you to make the long drive down from Atlanta." Her grip was firm and professional, the handshake of a woman who negotiated her own contracts. "Thank you for the invitation," I responded, carefully maintaining the agreed-upon fiction. "Your family home is beautiful." Amelia tilted her head just a fraction of an inch. Her gaze lingered on my face for 2 seconds longer than a standard polite greeting required. She was instinctively searching for the connective tissue between her polished fiancé and the tired, guarded woman standing in front of him. "I was reviewing the final seating arrangement just a moment ago," Amelia said, turning her sharp gaze back to Grant. "Why is Sarah seated all the way in the back corner? Surely we can have the staff bring up an extra chair to a better table." Grant immediately stepped between us, deploying a smooth, practiced smile that functioned as a defensive shield. "It is just a technical arrangement, Amelia," he smoothly deflected, placing a gentle, guiding hand on the small of her back. "The front tables were strictly locked in weeks ago for the campaign donors and the housing committee members. Sarah completely understands. It is purely a logistical placement, nothing more." He ushered her back inside before she could protest further, leaving me to follow in their wake. I walked into the grand foyer and immediately spotted the massive, gold-framed seating chart displayed on an ornate wooden easel. The calligraphy was elegant and looping. I found my parents, Thomas and Elaine, listed at table 4, positioned in the prime real estate right next to the senator's central table. I dragged my finger down the heavy cardstock, past the wealthy developers, the political strategists, and the local elite. Right at the very bottom, printed in slightly smaller ink, was my name, Table 19. I walked into the main ballroom. The space was breathtaking, featuring vaulted ceilings, massive crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the dark, rolling ocean. I walked past the center tables, draped in heavy white linen and adorned with towering floral centerpieces. I kept walking as the lighting grew slightly dimmer, past the secondary guests, until I hit the absolute physical boundary of the room. Table 19 was shoved tightly against the back wall, positioned directly beside the heavy, brass-plated swinging doors that led into the catering kitchen. It was the service artery of the event. Every 30 seconds, a waiter would burst through the doors carrying massive trays of roasted meats or empty champagne flutes, hitting my shoulders with a constant, jarring draft of hot kitchen air and the loud clatter of industrial dishwashing. My table mates consisted of 2 exhausted junior campaign aides and an elderly couple who seemed thoroughly confused about why they were invited. We were the demographic that did not require priority. I sat down on the velvet-cushioned chair. The physical comfort of the seat was a sharp, mocking contrast to the sheer indignity of its location. This was a masterclass in velvet-covered humiliation. From my forgotten corner by the kitchen doors, I possessed a wide, unobstructed, and entirely invisible view of the entire ballroom. I sat in the shadows and watched the elite machinery operate. It was a room entirely built on transactions. I watched men in expensive suits exchange handshakes that I knew carried the weight of hundreds of thousands of dollars in municipal contracts. I watched polite laughter being carefully weighed and distributed, based on the recipient's political influence, and in the center of it all, I watched my brother. Grant was navigating the room with a terrifying grace. He deployed a specific, radiant smile that I had never once seen him use inside our childhood home. It was a highly manufactured expression, crafted exclusively for strangers who held the keys to his upward mobility. He looked like a man who had successfully rewritten his entire history, as a waiter brushed roughly past my chair, accidentally knocking my silverware askew. The final, crushing realization settled into my bones. I stared at the pristine white tablecloth in front of me. Grant had not allowed me to attend this dinner to share in his joy. He had not brought me here to simply stand on the sidelines and witness his ultimate social victory. I was summoned to Table 19 to serve as a living, breathing proof of concept. By sitting here, silently accepting my placement among the dirty dishes and the swinging doors, I was demonstrating my absolute compliance. I was invited purely to prove that I was fully willing to be erased from my own family's story without staging a rebellion. He wanted to look across the room, see me sitting in the dark, and know that he had successfully buried the truth. The first course arrived with a synchronized clattering of fine porcelain. Servers in starched white vests moved like a highly trained military unit, dropping plates of seared scallops and microgreens in front of the priority guests. Down at my end of the vast room, a hurried busboy unceremoniously slid a plate onto my table, instantly retreating through the swinging brass doors. I ignored the food entirely. The acoustics of the grand ballroom were intentionally designed to amplify the voices at the center, carrying the conversations of the elite outward like ripples in a pond. I sat in the shadows, my hands folded perfectly still in my lap, and simply listened. The wealthy do not converse, they broadcast. Over the gentle clinking of heavy crystal goblets, I caught fragments of their highly polished dialogue. They discussed upcoming political campaigns, highly leveraged charitable foundations, and exclusive coastal real estate acquisitions. The dominant buzzword floating above the center tables, repeated like a religious mantra, was sustainable housing. A sudden booming laugh erupted from a man seated 2 tables away from my parents. The sound was rich, overly confident, and deeply familiar. I shifted my gaze past the towering floral centerpieces and locked onto the source. The man holding court was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a thick mane of silver hair and a ruddy complexion that spoke of endless weekends on private yachts. He was leaning back in his velvet chair, swirling a glass of dark red wine, surrounded by a rapt audience of junior politicians and eager investors. Someone addressed him by name, and the syllables hit my ears with the force of a physical blow. Lowell Pike. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I reached for my water glass, my fingers closing around the cold crystal with enough force to turn my knuckles stark white. Lowell Pike was the undisputed titan of Vantage Meridian Holdings. To the people in this room, he was a visionary real estate developer, a generous philanthropist, and a key player in urban modernization. To me, he was the face of a near-catastrophic disaster. He was currently dominating the conversation, gesturing expansively with his free hand. "The absolute key to the future is safe urbanization," Pike declared loudly, his voice oozing with practiced, unearned authority. "We have to build smart. We have to prioritize community security over rapid expansion. That is the only way forward." A wave of pure nausea washed over me. I tightened my grip on the glass, half expecting it to crack in my hand. Safe urbanization. Hearing those words come out of his mouth felt like a grotesque distortion of reality. I remembered the harsh glare of halogen work lights cutting through concrete dust. I remembered the deep, ominous groan of sheer stress reverberating through a subterranean parking garage. Most vividly, I remembered the heavily doctored technical files, the deliberately ignored load-bearing metrics, and the frantic attempts to bury the truth about a foundation that was compromised by nearly 30%. Pike did not care about safe urbanization or community security. He cared strictly about profit margins, and he was perfectly willing to risk hundreds of human lives to protect them. I dragged my eyes away from Pike's smiling face and scanned the rest of the room. Amelia Mercer was seated at the head table, looking stunning, but her body language was rigid with unspoken tension. She was not playing the role of the happily oblivious bride-to-be. Instead, her incredibly sharp gaze kept flicking toward the back of the room, toward me. Every time a guest approached their table to offer congratulations, Grant would skillfully maneuver his body, creating a physical barrier that blocked Amelia's line of sight to my hidden corner. He was aggressively managing the environment, desperately trying to keep her attention anchored to the center of the room. Amelia was entirely too smart for the distraction. She noticed his frantic evasion tactics. Her expression darkened slightly, a subtle tightening of her jaw. She was visibly irritated that Grant was actively avoiding any proper introduction. To her, the woman banished to the service doors was an annoying, unresolved detail that threatened to ruin the perfect family portrait her father had painstakingly arranged. I looked toward the fourth table, searching for any sign of recognition from the people who raised me. My mother, Elaine, sat with a posture so rigidly perfect it looked physically painful. She was engaged in a very animated conversation with the wife of a federal judge. Her head angled deliberately away from the rear of the ballroom. She had not glanced in my direction a single time since I sat down. My father, Thomas, was less disciplined. As a waiter leaned over to pour his wine, his eyes briefly flickered toward the kitchen doors. For one split second, our gazes met across the vast expanse of white linen and sparkling silver. His face immediately drained of color. He flinched, snapping his head back to his plate with terrifying speed, as if merely acknowledging my existence would somehow magnify his own crushing guilt. They were not just ignoring me, they were actively pretending I had ceased to exist the moment I walked onto the property. The gentle tapping of a silver spoon against a crystal flute cut through the ambient noise. The room quieted rapidly. Grant stood at the center table, adjusting the cuffs of his tuxedo, a picture of absolute confidence and carefully manufactured humility. He raised his glass toward Senator Mercer, offering a deeply respectful nod before turning to address the room. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," Grant began, his voice projecting smoothly without the need for a microphone. "Joining this incredible family is the greatest honor of my life. Senator, you have built a legacy on transparency, dedication, and service. Those are the exact same pillars I have always strived to build my own life upon." I sat perfectly still, the cold water from my glass beginning to leave heavy condensation on my fingertips. The sheer audacity of his speech was staggering. "I have spent my career at Calder Row Advisory, helping to build better, stronger communities," Grant continued, placing a loving hand on Amelia's shoulder. "But professional success means absolutely nothing without a strong moral foundation. I am a self-made man, but I did not get here alone. I was raised with an unwavering spirit of family, a strict adherence to ethics, and the fundamental belief that integrity is the only currency that truly matters." A cold chill violently raced down my spine, sinking deep into my bones. He was feeding them a masterfully polished narrative of a man driven by moral superiority. But as he spoke the word ethics, my eyes drifted back to Lowell Pike, who was nodding in aggressive agreement, raising his own glass in a silent toast to my brother. The scattered pieces of the puzzle suddenly slammed together in my mind with a deafening crash. Grant worked for Calder Row Advisory, an elite consulting firm that specialized in navigating complex zoning laws and securing fast-tracked municipal approvals for massive development projects. Lowell Pike ran Vantage Meridian Holdings, the massive corporate entity that built those exact projects, our worlds. The sanitized corporate offices and the dirty construction sites had collided in the past. My brother had not banned me from the center tables because my dress was too plain. He had not forced me to hide my last name because my career was too rough and unpolished for polite society. He was not ashamed of my faded car or my occasional limp. Those were all convenient, cruel excuses designed to break my spirit and ensure my total, unquestioning compliance. The real truth was far more dangerous. Grant was absolutely terrified. He had looked at the guest list for his own engagement dinner and realized that if Sarah Crosby, the senior structural safety investigator, was introduced by name to the men sitting at the primary tables, the entire carefully constructed facade of his career would instantly disintegrate. He was not hiding me because I was an embarrassment. He was hiding me because I was a catastrophic liability. Somewhere in the dark history of his rapid rise to power, his path had violently intersected with Lowell Pike's dirty architecture. If someone in this room connected my face, my name, and my profession to the events of the past, the resulting explosion would not just ruin a fancy dinner party, it would level his entire meticulously built life. I slowly released my tight grip on the water glass. The frantic, nervous energy that had plagued me all evening completely evaporated, replaced by a strange, icy calm. I was sitting at the very edge of the room, surrounded by dirty dishes and ignored by my own blood. But as I watched Grant smile and drink his expensive champagne, I realized I was actually holding the detonator. 18 months ago, the air inside the Metropolitan Structural Integrity Bureau Command Center smelled of stale dark roast coffee and burnt ozone. It was nearing midnight on a Tuesday when the critical telemetry warning violently flashed across my primary monitoring screen. The alert was specifically tagged to Halcyon Tower. It was a brand new, ultra-luxury residential high-rise that completely dominated the Atlanta skyline. The building had been open for occupancy for less than 1 week. I rapidly pulled up the live sensor feeds, my eyes scanning the cascading rows of technical readouts. My stomach instantly dropped into a cold, bottomless pit. The raw data pouring into the mainframe from the subterranean parking levels and the primary load-bearing elevator core was absolutely terrifying. We were not looking at standard architectural settling. The digital gauges showed rapid, aggressively accelerating lateral displacement. The structural concrete was actively failing. I grabbed my heavy field jacket and drove my sedan straight to the site, breaking at least 4 major traffic laws in the process. When I finally arrived at the sleek, towering glass lobby, everything looked deceptively, horrifyingly calm. Soft classical jazz played seamlessly through hidden acoustic speakers. The overnight concierge was quietly polishing a brass railing near the front desk. Upstairs, on the 50th floor, an exclusive, closed-door VIP reception was in full swing to celebrate a massive new urban housing initiative. I completely bypassed the front desk and took the heavy service stairwell directly down to the 3rd sub-level engineering deck. The moment I pushed the heavy fire door open, I did not even need to look at a computer screen to verify the danger. I could hear it. Buildings speak when they are dying. The sound was a deep, guttural groaning of steel rebar stretching past its ultimate yield point. It was punctuated by the sharp, terrifying cracks of concrete microfractures violently snapping under immense physical pressure. I sprinted down the concrete corridor and burst into the site manager's field office. The room was chaotic. A man in a sharp, incredibly expensive bespoke suit was actively arguing with the head facility engineer. The man in the suit was a crisis management lawyer, dispatched by the building developer to handle the sensor anomaly. "You are completely overreacting," the lawyer snapped, loudly slapping his hand flat on the metal desk. "We have highly influential investors, state politicians, and media executives upstairs in the penthouse right now. If we pull the fire alarms and drag them out onto the freezing street in the middle of the night because of a faulty sensor glitch, the stock price of this company will tank by morning. We wait for further verification. We will bring in our own independent structural team tomorrow at dawn." I stepped forward, unclipped my heavy brass badge, and threw it onto the table, sliding it right under his chin. "There is no tomorrow," I told him. I kept my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of any room for negotiation. The sheer stress on the central core is increasing exponentially. The basement columns are undergoing rapid compression failure as we speak. You do not have hours. You have minutes before a massive chain reaction collapse levels this entire sector. You do not have the legal authority to kill $1 billion project over a wild hunch, the lawyer threatened, stepping aggressively into my personal space, trying to use his height to intimidate me. "Do you have any idea who is in that penthouse? I do not care if the President of the United States is drinking champagne up there," I fired back, holding his gaze without blinking a single time. "I am the lead field investigator for the Metropolitan Structural Integrity Bureau, and I am formally taking operational control of this site right now." I shoved roughly past him, reached the central emergency control console on the wall, and physically smashed my palm against the mass evacuation trigger. The deafening, piercing shriek of the building-wide alarms instantly drowned out his furious protests. The automated system instantly grounded all elevators to the lobby level, locking their doors to prevent anyone from being trapped in the shafts. The automated voice protocols blared through every speaker on every floor, ordering everyone into the reinforced emergency stairwells. I spent the next agonizing block of time standing in the massive glass lobby, physically directing the confused, angry, and panicked residents and guests as they poured out of the stairwells. They stumbled onto the polished marble floor, wearing heavy designer gowns and perfectly tailored suits. Many were still clutching crystal champagne flutes, complaining loudly to the security staff about the outrageous inconvenience. Among the furious crowd pushing toward the exit, I briefly locked eyes with two women who were being hurriedly ushered out by a private security detail. One was an older, highly elegant woman gripping her coat tight against her chest. That was Elise Mercer, the wife of the senator. Beside her was a much younger woman, looking pale but remarkably composed, firmly holding her mother's arm to keep her steady in the chaotic crush of bodies. It was Amelia Mercer. I did not know their specific names at the time. I only knew they were part of the elite VIP group that the corporate lawyer was perfectly willing to let die just to save a temporary stock price. I forced the very last stragglers out through the revolving glass doors and ran out to the street perimeter just as the local police established a flashing barricade. Exactly 12 minutes after the lobby was completely cleared, the pavement violently shuddered beneath my boots. It was not a localized tremor. It felt like a massive subterranean bomb had just detonated. Before our eyes, the Halcyon Tower let out a horrifying groan. A massive cloud of thick, choking gray dust violently blew out from the underground garage ventilation shafts, instantly shattering the street-level windows. The entire towering structure dropped several feet with a deafening, sickening crunch as the first 3 parking levels completely pancaked into one another. A massive, jagged fissure ripped straight up the exterior glass facade, tearing through 20 floors of luxury apartments like wet tissue paper. The building did not completely topple into the street, but its foundational integrity was completely annihilated. It was a dead structure, standing purely on borrowed friction. If I had listened to that lawyer, if I had waited even 10 minutes for further verification, the central core would have dragged the crowded penthouse down into a mountain of twisted steel and crushed concrete. Over 300 people would have been buried alive, including some of the most famous political faces in the entire state. I stood on the sidewalk, covered head to toe in a fine layer of white concrete dust, trembling slightly from the sheer adrenaline crash, watching the red and blue emergency lights flash against the ruined glass. However, saving human lives does not automatically make you a hero in a city built heavily on corrupt real estate deals and massive political egos. It makes you a massive, unforgivable liability. The aftermath of the Halcyon collapse was an absolute bloodbath. The developers faced billions of dollars in catastrophic losses and immediate criminal negligence investigations. In their desperate, flailing attempt to deflect blame from their own massive failures, they directed their highly paid legal assassins directly at me. They desperately needed a scapegoat to muddy the public waters, someone to blame for the massive panic and the financial ruin. A few weeks after the dust settled, a highly classified legal memo began circulating among the city council members and my upper superiors at the bureau. It was a meticulously crafted, utterly devastating piece of character assassination. The author did not just criticize my engineering calculations, they aggressively attacked my core psychology. The memo confidently claimed I was historically prone to acting erratically under pressure. It stated that I possessed a reckless, highly unstable desire to exaggerate structural risks in order to inflate my own professional importance. It argued that my unilateral decision to order the evacuation was a gross, hysterical overreaction that unnecessarily destroyed the developer's sterling reputation and caused millions in collateral damage. The document was a cold, calculated attempt to freeze my career, revoke my license, and completely destroy my credibility before I could ever testify in federal court. The memo was not signed with a full corporate name. It was only stamped with 2 simple initials at the very bottom of the final page, GRC. I spent 6 agonizing months fighting for my professional life. I was immediately benched, placed on administrative leave, and forced to defend every single keystroke of my structural analysis. I sat through endless tribunal hearings, exhausted and heavily isolated, wondering exactly who GC was and why they possessed such an intimate, venomous understanding of my personality to weaponize it so effectively against me. The nightmare only ended when a federal independent oversight committee finally subpoenaed the raw, unedited sensor logs directly from the Halcyon mainframe. The hard data was undeniable. The committee published a binding public report concluding that the subterranean columns were indeed less than 5 minutes away from a total, catastrophic shear failure when I hit the alarm. I was completely exonerated. The report officially stated that my perfectly timed interventions saved hundreds of lives. I got my badge back. I went back to the dust, the blueprints, and the concrete. But I never forgot the crushing feeling of reading that memo. I never discovered the true identity behind those two initials. I only knew that whoever GC was, they were a ghost in a tailored suit. A person who had methodically tried to erase my truth to protect a kingdom built entirely on fractured foundations. The dessert plates had been cleared away, replaced by the low hum of satisfied guests and the clinking of small porcelain espresso cups. I sat quietly in my designated corner, watching the grandfather clock near the hallway indicate it was approaching 10 o'clock in the evening. My physical presence was no longer required. I had served my purpose as the silent, compliant ghost. I mentally mapped my exit route, planning to slip out through the heavy brass doors, find my fated sedan, and drive the 4 hours back to Atlanta. Across the vast ballroom, Senator Warren Mercer stood up from his central position. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, picked up a bottle of reserve red wine, and began the traditional host rotation. He moved effortlessly from table to table, deploying a masterclass in political charisma. He offered warm handshakes, poured wine, and shared brief, intimately tailored anecdotes with his wealthy donors. He was slowly but deliberately working his way toward the outer edges of the room. I kept my head slightly bowed, focusing on the intricate weave of the white tablecloth. I fully expected him to offer a polite, generic nod to our marginalized group and quickly pivot back toward the center of power. He reached table 19. He poured a splash of wine for the elderly man seated to my left, offering a gracious thank you for his attendance. Then, he turned his gaze toward me. I looked up, meeting his eyes out of basic, unavoidable politeness. Warren Mercer froze. It was not a subtle hesitation. It was a violent, physical halt. The expensive bottle of wine in his right hand actually trembled, the dark ruby liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim of the glass neck. The practiced, incredibly smooth smile of the veteran politician instantly vanished, entirely replaced by the raw, unfiltered shock of a man witnessing a savior materialize in his dining room. He did not recognize my plain black dress or my tightly pinned hair. Those superficial details meant absolutely nothing to him. What he recognized was the unflinching, deeply analytical stare of the woman who had once stood in a chaotic glass lobby and refused to back down while the ground literally shook beneath their feet. He recognized the exact same eyes that had calmly orchestrated the salvation of his entire world. "Sarah," Mercer breathed out, the single word cutting through the ambient noise of our corner with surgical precision. "Sarah Crosby." The two junior campaign aides seated across from me stopped mid-sentence. The elderly couple stared in profound confusion. The senator of their state had just dropped his perfectly manicured composure for the woman sitting in the worst seat in the House. "Good evening, Senator," I replied, my voice perfectly level. Mercer did not return the pleasantry. His eyes darted rapidly from my face to the swinging service doors inches from my shoulder, then down to my table setting. He registered the hastily placed silverware, the complete lack of a floral centerpiece, and my empty water glass that no server had bothered to fill for the past 2 hours. The political charm evaporated, leaving behind a terrifying, cold authority. "Why are you sitting here?" Mercer demanded. The temperature in our immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. It was not a question born of confusion. It was a question born of rising, highly protective anger. "It is just a logistical placement, sir," I offered, reciting the exact excuse my brother had fed to Amelia earlier in the evening. "The tables were fully booked. I am perfectly fine." "Do not insult my intelligence, Sarah," Mercer said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a fierce, unmistakable intensity. "You are sitting in the service draft. You are sitting exactly where they put people they actively want to hide." He placed the bottle of wine down on the table with a hard, sharp thud that made the junior aides physically jump. He did not ask for my permission. He did not politely invite me. He simply extended his hand toward me, his palm open, issuing a silent, absolute command. "Stand up," Mercer instructed. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, the heavy weight of the entire room suddenly pressing down on my shoulders. I knew exactly what standing up meant. It meant the permanent end of my compliance. It meant detonating the lie my brother had so carefully constructed. I looked at his outstretched hand, took a slow, deep breath, and stood. "Come with me," he said. Senator Mercer did not walk slightly ahead of me or slightly behind me. He walked exactly beside me, his hand hovering protectively near my elbow, as if he were escorting a highly decorated visiting dignitary. We moved away from the shadows of the kitchen doors and stepped directly into the bright, unyielding light of the central ballroom. Our progression across the floor was not loud, but it possessed a massive, undeniable gravitational pull. As we passed table 15, the loud laughter died abruptly. As we passed table 10, a wealthy real estate developer stopped speaking mid-sentence, his silver fork hovering awkwardly in the air. By the time we crossed the invisible threshold into the inner circle of priority seating, the entire ballroom had grown terrifyingly quiet. The ambient noise dialed down like a slowly rotating dimmer switch until the only sound was the sharp, rhythmic clicking of my practical leather heels against the polished hardwood floor. I kept my chin raised, my eyes focused strictly on the head table. Amelia Mercer was the first person to react. She was incredibly perceptive, and all evening she had been quietly accumulating mismatched data points. She had noted Grant's strange, aggressive physical blocking. She had sensed his forced, overly manicured charm. She had questioned my bizarre, insulting seating placement. Now, watching her powerful father personally escort the hidden guest of honor through a sea of silent billionaires, the final pieces of the puzzle violently snapped together in her mind. Amelia stood up abruptly. Her heavy emerald gown caught the chandelier light as she pushed her chair back. She did not look confused. She looked utterly astounded, her sharp eyes darting between my calm face and her father's fiercely protective posture. She realized instantly that I was not merely a distant, unpolished colleague of Elaine Crosby. I was someone of immense, undeniable importance to her family. We reached the absolute center of the room. The silence was now total, thick, and incredibly suffocating. My parents, seated just a few feet away at table 4, looked as though they had been physically struck by lightning. My mother's face was completely bloodless, her hand clamped tightly over her mouth to muffle a gasp. My father was staring intensely down at his untouched plate, absolutely paralyzed by the unfolding reality. But it was Grant who drew my final, most intense focus. My brother was standing right next to Amelia, entirely frozen in place. The manufactured, charismatic glow he had weaponized all night was entirely gone. His skin had turned a sickening, translucent shade of gray. It was not the mild, embarrassed complexion of a man who had simply been caught in a minor social lie. It was the deep, terrifying pallor of a man who suddenly realizes the ground he built his entire kingdom upon has just opened up to swallow him whole. He looked at me, and then he looked at Senator Mercer, and in that split second, I saw the exact moment his confidence completely fractured. Senator Mercer turned slightly to face the hundreds of powerful guests, his presence commanding absolute, unquestioning attention. He did not need to raise his voice. When he finally spoke, the pristine acoustics of the room carried his words to every single corner, ensuring no one missed the impending revelation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mercer announced, his voice carrying the heavy, emotional weight of a man publicly acknowledging a sacred debt. "There has been an egregious error in our seating arrangement tonight, and it is an error I intend to correct immediately." "Ladies and gentlemen," Mercer continued, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings and completely commanding the attention of every billionaire, politician, and socialite in the room. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate family. We are here to celebrate the merging of lives, the building of new futures, and the trust that binds us together. But there is a distinct difference between building a future on a solid foundation and building it on a convenient illusion. He turned his body slightly, gesturing toward me with a profound, unwavering respect. I stood perfectly still under the blinding glare of the chandeliers. 18 months ago, my wife and my daughter were attending a private function in the penthouse of a newly constructed high-rise right here in our state, Mercer stated. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Even the catering staff lingering near the walls stopped moving. That building was catastrophically compromised. It was minutes away from a complete structural collapse that would have buried everyone inside. The people responsible for that building tried to hide the danger to protect their investments. They tried to buy time. They tried to silence the warning alarms. A low, uneasy murmur rippled through the front tables. The guests knew exactly what event he was referencing. "The only reason Elise and Amelia are standing in this room tonight," Mercer said, his voice hardening into absolute steel, "is because the lead investigator on site refused to be intimidated. She walked into a room full of powerful men, looked them in the eye, and forced an immediate evacuation. She saved hundreds of lives. And when those same cowards tried to destroy her career afterward to cover their tracks, she never backed down. She held the line for the truth." Mercer placed his hand gently on my shoulder. "I had no idea she was on the guest list tonight, but it is my immense honor to formally introduce you all to Sarah Crosby." The reaction was instantaneous and electric. A wave of stunned whispers swept across the white tablecloths. A prominent federal judge at table 2 slowly stood up and began to clap, and within seconds, a cascade of applause rolled through the room. It was polite at first, then genuinely thunderous. I did not smile. I did not wave. I simply maintained my posture, my eyes locked securely on the head table. Mercer raised his hand, signaling for quiet. The applause died down rapidly, replaced by a thick, expectant silence. He turned to me with a warm, genuinely curious expression. "Sarah, please forgive my ignorance," Mercer said, his tone shifting to conversational warmth. "Amelia managed the majority of the invitations. How exactly do you know Grant?" The question hung in the air. Perfectly innocent. Completely devastating. I did not look at my parents, who were currently staring at the floor as if praying it would open up and swallow them. I looked directly at my brother. Grant's eyes were wide, silently begging me to maintain the lie, pleading with me to protect his fragile, manufactured empire. He had demanded my silence. He had banished me to the service doors to ensure his survival. "He is my brother," I replied. My voice was not loud, but in the absolute silence of the ballroom, it rang out like a gunshot. The shockwave that hit the room was visceral. It was not a gasp. It was a collective, violent recoiling. The polished veneer of the evening cracked wide open. People whipped their heads toward the central table, staring at the golden boy of Calder Row Advisory. Amelia Mercer slowly turned her head to look at the man she was supposed to marry. Her expression was utterly unreadable, a terrifying mask of aristocratic composure masking a deeply analytical mind rapidly processing a massive betrayal. She looked at Grant as if he had just unzipped his skin and revealed an entirely different human being underneath. "Your brother," Mercer repeated. The warmth completely vanished from the senator's face. He looked from me to Grant, the political calculus running at lightning speed behind his eyes. Grant scrambled violently to patch the massive hole in his ship. He smoothed his tuxedo jacket, pasting a sickeningly calm, condescending smile onto his pale face. "It is exactly as I told you earlier, Amelia," Grant said, his voice slightly higher than its usual practiced baritone. "I just wanted to keep things simple tonight. This evening was supposed to be about us, about our families coming together. Sarah and I have a somewhat complicated dynamic, and I honestly did not want to distract from the celebration by bringing up past family history. It was purely an attempt to manage the room and keep the focus where it belonged." Every single word that fell from his mouth sounded incredibly calculated, desperately thin, and profoundly callous. He was bleeding credibility onto the floor with every syllable. Amelia did not blink. She did not yell. She simply tilted her head, her voice dropping to a dangerous, conversational whisper that carried a massive amount of weight. "You told me she was an old friend of your mother," Amelia stated coldly. "You actively lied to my face on the front porch. And if you simply wanted to keep things simple, Grant, why did you orchestrate placing the woman who saved my life at a table shoved against the kitchen doors? Why did you hide your own sister in the dark?" Grant opened his mouth to formulate another spin, but before he could speak, a loud scraping noise violently interrupted the interrogation. Lowell Pike pushed his chair back and stood up from a neighboring table. The real estate titan buttoned his suit jacket, projecting an aura of aggressive, condescending authority. He was used to dominating rooms, and he clearly saw an opportunity to rescue his useful consultant while simultaneously defending his own dirty industry. "Now, let us not let emotions ruin a beautiful evening. Senator," Pike said loudly, offering a patronizing chuckle, "I am sure Grant had his reasons, and as for the Halcyon Tower incident, let us be completely clear. That was a highly unfortunate technical misunderstanding that was wildly blown out of proportion by a media hungry for a scandal. The building suffered a minor settling issue. It was hardly the apocalyptic disaster some rogue investigators claimed it was. We need to focus on moving forward, not dragging up old, exaggerated ghost stories." The room held its breath, waiting to see if the senator would rebuke the massive donor. I did not wait. I turned away from Grant and locked my eyes directly onto Lowell Pike. I did not raise my voice a single decibel, but the absolute certainty in my tone cut through his arrogance like a surgical blade. "It was not a minor settling issue, Mr. Pike," I said calmly. "The subterranean telemetry logs registered 22 degrees of rapid lateral shift in the primary elevator core within a 4-minute window. The concrete mix used in Sector 4 showed a shear strength deficit 35% below the legally mandated safety baseline. And the site management team ignored 99 separate automated proximity warnings over the preceding 48 hours just to keep the VIP floor open." Pike's patronizing smile instantly vanished. The color aggressively drained from his ruddy cheeks. "Those are highly classified technical details," Pike sputtered, his voice suddenly thick with genuine panic. "Only the Senior Internal Review Board and the primary contractors had access to those specific structural metrics. I am the person who wrote the structural metrics," I replied softly. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Pike practically collapsed back into his velvet chair, looking like a man who had just accidentally stepped on a landmine in front of the entire state legislature. By trying to dismiss my work, Pike had inadvertently pulled the string on a much larger, much darker secret. Senator Mercer was not just a grieving father. He was a brilliant political strategist. I watched the realization dawn on his face. Mercer looked at the terrified real estate developer, then looked at the pale, sweating consultant who had lied about his own sister, and he connected the fatal dots. Grant had not hidden me because I lacked social grace. Grant had hidden me because powerful men in this exact room were deeply terrified of what I knew. The engagement dinner did not explode into screaming or thrown wine glasses. The wealthy do not riot. They simply freeze you out. Mercer did not say another word. He offered me a curt, deeply respectful nod, then slowly walked back to his seat. The guests gradually, awkwardly resumed their conversations, but the volume was muted, the tone deeply fractured. The beautiful, flawless illusion of the Crosby-Mercer merger was completely shattered. I looked at the head table one last time. Amelia Mercer had finally sat back down. However, she was no longer leaning toward my brother. She had physically shifted her chair several inches to the left, putting a distinct, undeniable gap between them. She sat with her spine perfectly straight, looking straight ahead, while Grant stared down at his plate, entirely isolated in a crowded room. Her instinct had warned her that something was wrong, and now she knew she was sitting next to a man who had not even begun to tell the whole truth. The morning sun cut sharply through the heavy mahogany blinds of Senator Warren Mercer's private library. The room smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and cold, brewed coffee. It was barely 8 o'clock, but the atmosphere inside the sprawling estate was already suffocating. Mercer sat behind a massive oak desk, his face etched with deep lines of exhaustion that had not been there the evening before. He had not summoned me here to manage a public relations crisis or draft a polite press release. He had called this closed-door meeting to surgically dissect a lie. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, holding a thick manila folder resting on my knees. Next to me sat Amelia. If the ruined dinner had broken her heart, she refused to let it show. Instead, she radiated the cold, terrifying focus of a woman who had just realized her entire romantic future was a carefully constructed hostile takeover. She wore a simple gray sweater, her hair pulled back tightly, her eyes ringed with the faint, bruised shadows of a sleepless night. "I did not sleep," Amelia began, her voice completely devoid of any trembling or hesitation. "I spent the last 10 hours cross-referencing public media archives from the Halcyon Tower collapse with the corporate employment records of Calder Row Advisory." She placed a sleek silver laptop on the edge of her father's desk and turned the screen toward us. "Grant told me he only started consulting for Vantage Meridian Holdings 6 months ago. He claimed it was a brand new account. That was a lie. 18 months ago, during the exact week of the structural failure, Grant was operating as a junior legal consultant for a subsidiary firm directly attached to the Halcyon project." I opened my manila folder and extracted the heavy stack of paper I had carried with me from Atlanta. I laid the federal independent oversight conclusion flat on the polished wood. Next to it, I placed the printed copies of the anonymous, heavily redacted legal memos that had been aggressively circulated to destroy my professional credibility in the aftermath of the evacuation. "When the building fractured," I told them, keeping my tone entirely analytical, "the developers desperately needed a scapegoat to absorb the catastrophic financial fallout and the criminal negligence charges. Someone generated a highly coordinated character assassination campaign against me. They tried to legally freeze my license and bury my structural reports." I slid the final page of the smear campaign across the desk. "The primary author of the strategy was never fully identified in the public hearings. The documents were only signed with 2 initials." Senator Mercer leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses. He stared at the bottom of the page, his jaw tightening into a hard, unforgiving line. The letters GC stared back at us in stark black ink. Amelia hit a key on her laptop. A new document filled the screen. It was an internal corporate email chain she had managed to pull from a digital archive of subpoenaed communications related to the early Halcyon lawsuits. The sender was Grant Crosby. "Read his exact proposal," Amelia instructed, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I leaned in and read the text glowing on the screen. It was a strategic recommendation sent to Lowell Pike's senior crisis management team just 3 days after I had pulled the fire alarm. Grant had outlined a step-by-step protocol for controlling the public narrative. He explicitly advised them to pivot the media focus away from the compromised concrete load bearings and direct it entirely onto the field investigator. He wrote that they needed to position me as an extreme personality who acted erratically under pressure. A sudden, sickening wave of nausea violently hit my stomach. My breath hitched in my throat as the words burned themselves into my retinas. Erratic, extreme, prone to exaggeration. My mind violently snapped back to the miserable, lonely months I had spent fighting the investigative tribunals. I remembered sitting in my parents' living room, exhausted and terrified of losing my career, begging for their emotional support. I remembered my mother, Elaine, pouring a cup of tea, looking at me with cold disappointment, and telling me to stop fighting the corporate lawyers. "You have always been an extreme personality. Sarah," my mother had said to me all those months ago, "you act erratically when you are stressed. You are exaggerating the danger to make yourself look important. You need to just drop this crusade before you embarrass the family further." The realization hit me with the blunt force of a swinging steel beam. I had to grip the armrests of my chair to keep my hands from shaking. My mother had not come up with those cruel, hyper-specific words on her own. Grant had fed them to her. He had weaponized our own parents against me. He had used his golden child status to convince them I was mentally unstable, ensuring I would have zero familial support while he actively helped a corrupt billionaire try to destroy my life in the public arena. He did not hide you last night because he was embarrassed by your car or your job, Mercer said slowly, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was settling heavily over the room. He hid you because if I saw your face and heard your name, I would instantly connect you to the tower. And if I looked into the tower, I would inevitably find his fingerprints all over the knife in your back. The twist was agonizingly brilliant in its cruelty. Grant had successfully insulated himself. He had managed to court and propose to the daughter of the very family who had almost died in that building, while simultaneously hiding the fact that he was the architect of the smear campaign against their savior. But Senator Mercer was a man who understood that personal tragedy was often just the surface layer of a much deeper, more dangerous political rot. He stood up from his desk and walked over to the tall windows, looking out at the manicured lawns. "It gets worse," Mercer stated, his broad shoulders tense beneath his crisp dress shirt. "Much worse. This is not just about Grant trying to protect his engagement or his social standing." He turned back to face us. "For the past 6 months, I have been assembling a massive, federally backed national urban housing initiative. We are preparing to allocate hundreds of millions of dollars to subsidize safe, affordable, and structurally advanced housing developments across 3 states. It is the crowning legislative achievement of my career." Amelia closed her laptop with a sharp, definitive click. "And Grant's firm, Calder Rowe, was just brought on as the primary legal advisory board for the initiative." "Exactly," Mercer confirmed, his voice echoing with grim certainty. "And last night, at the dinner, Grant was officially supposed to introduce Lowell Pike to my senior committee members. Pike is aggressively maneuvering Vantage Meridian Holdings to secure the primary construction contracts for the entire government initiative. The pieces locked perfectly into place, forming a terrifying, massive picture of systemic corruption. Grant was the inside man. He had used his relationship with Amelia to gain direct, intimate access to the senator. He was leveraging his impending marriage to legitimize Lowell Pike, the exact same man who routinely falsified engineering reports and built collapsing towers. They were setting up a pipeline to funnel hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars straight into the pockets of a corporate entity completely devoid of structural ethics. If I had not shown up last night, if I had simply stayed in Atlanta and let them have their perfect evening, the lie would have solidified into concrete. Grant would have officially become family. Pike would have secured the federal contracts, and the very men who were perfectly willing to let Elise and Amelia Mercer die under thousands of tons of rubble would be handed the power to build the future of our cities. This was no longer a simple story of a brother being ashamed of his sister. It had escalated into a massive moral, political, and personal deadlock. We were standing at the edge of a precipice. If Senator Mercer chose to stay quiet, to avoid a massive public scandal and protect his daughter from the humiliation of a broken engagement, he would be actively aiding and abetting the corruption. He would be allowing Grant to escape all consequences, effectively building a national legacy on a foundation of absolute fraud. "He expects us to sweep this under the rug," Amelia said softly, breaking the heavy silence. "He expects me to care more about the wedding invitations and the social embarrassment than the fact that he tried to destroy the woman who saved my life." "What are you going to do?" I asked, looking directly at the senator. Mercer walked back to his desk, his posture straightening, the exhaustion completely vanishing from his eyes, replaced by the cold, calculating fire of a man preparing for absolute war. "Tomorrow night is the official gala to formally announce the housing initiative," Mercer said, his voice hard and resolute. "The press will be there. The governor will be there. Lowell Pike and your brother fully expect me to stand on that stage and endorse their involvement." He looked at his daughter, and then he looked at me. "We are going to let them walk right into the ballroom," Mercer declared. "We are going to let them put on their tuxedos and smile for the cameras. And then, we are going to dismantle them." By 12 o'clock the following afternoon, the historic Savannah riverfront was entirely consumed by the logistics of the impending gala. The event, hosted in the massive gold-leafed ballroom of a prominent riverside hotel, was a dual-purpose monolith. It was designed to be the highly publicized launch of Senator Mercer's National Urban Housing Fund, seamlessly blended with the formal celebration of his daughter's engagement. It was a runaway freight train of wealth and political influence. Canceling it at the very last minute was virtually impossible. Dozens of media outlets had already set up their satellite trucks along the cobblestone streets. Hundreds of wealthy donors, strategic corporate partners, and high-ranking state officials had already checked into their luxury suites. The sheer volume of money and expectation invested in the evening meant the show simply had to go on. The clock was aggressively ticking down to the evening reception, and the invisible pressure inside the Mercer estate was physically crushing. Grant cornered Amelia in the estate's sunroom just after 2 o'clock. I watched their interaction from the shadows of the adjacent hallway. He did not approach her with the genuine, frantic remorse of a man terrified of losing his true love. He approached her like a desperate corporate lawyer trying to salvage a severely hemorrhaging merger. He paced the length of the expensive Persian rug, running his manicured hands through his hair, begging her to maintain their unified front for just one more night. "Amelia, you have to listen to reason," Grant pleaded, his voice dripping with a highly calculated, sickeningly smooth desperation. "You are letting an ancient, highly complicated professional misunderstanding completely cloud your judgment. Sarah is projecting her severe past trauma onto my current career. It is heavily amplified by her own deep-seated insecurities and her aggressive personality. We absolutely cannot let a private family dispute derail this massive, statewide initiative. Just put your dress on, walk into that ballroom with me, and smile for the cameras tonight. We will sit down and sort out the internal family dynamics tomorrow morning. I promise you." The more he spoke, the more his polished veneer cracked, revealing the absolute moral bankruptcy underneath. He sounded exactly like a man accustomed to aggressively negotiating terms, completely incapable of simple honesty. Amelia stood perfectly still, her arms crossed tightly against her chest, her posture rigid and unyielding. She did not yell, she did not throw anything. She simply agreed to his terms with a terrifying, hollow calm. She promised to walk into that ballroom and stand exactly by his side. Grant visibly sagged with profound relief, entirely missing the lethal, analytical coldness in her dark eyes. Amelia was not agreeing to his terms to save their fractured relationship. She was agreeing because she possessed a brilliant, tactical mind. She wanted a front-row seat to watch exactly how deep his lies could go when he was handed a live microphone and bathed in the blinding spotlight of the public stage. While Grant was busy securing his fragile political shield downstairs, I was upstairs in a sprawling guest bedroom, aggressively shoving my practical clothes into my canvas duffel bag. I had absolutely zero intention of attending the gala. I had survived the agonizing, humiliating dinner, I had exposed the initial layer of the lie, and I had fulfilled my professional and moral obligation to Senator Mercer. I did not want to walk into a crowded, glittering ballroom and play the exhausting role of the bitter, vengeful sister seeking a theatrical public retribution. I was a senior field engineer, not a dramatic television personality. I wanted to drive back to Atlanta and leave them to their wealthy chaos. I was just pulling the heavy metal zipper of my bag closed when my cell phone vibrated violently against the polished mahogany nightstand. The screen displayed an encrypted email alert from an old, highly trusted contact back at the Metropolitan Structural Integrity Bureau. The subject line was completely blank, which immediately triggered my professional instincts. I opened the secure attachment. It was a massive, highly classified data dump containing the preliminary engineering schematics and the geotechnical surveys for the exact projects Lowell Pike was slated to build under Mercer's new federal initiative. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my eyes rapidly scanning the complex load-bearing algorithms and the dense soil density reports. My blood ran completely cold. The ambient noise of the ocean outside the window completely faded away, Lowell Pike had learned absolutely nothing from his near-fatal disaster at the Halcyon Tower. The newly leaked data clearly showed severe, deliberate manipulation of the foundation load assessments. It was the exact same lethal shortcut he had utilized 18 months ago, just buried under significantly more sophisticated mathematics and layers of corporate shell companies. He was actively planning to build towering, multi-story affordable housing units on fundamentally unstable soil, intentionally trimming the required structural steel budget by over 30% to maximize his corporate profit margin. It was the halcyon nightmare repeating itself, but this time, the potential casualties would not be thousands of wealthy politicians and VIP guests attending a penthouse party. They would be thousands of vulnerable, working-class families relying on government-subsidized safety. I grabbed my laptop, sprinted down the sweeping central staircase, and slammed the glowing screen down onto Senator Mercer's desk in the private library. I walked him through the falsified metrics line by terrifying line. The political calculus in Mercer's eyes instantly shifted into raw, unadulterated fury. He understood immediately that this was no longer just a protective father dealing with a deceitful fiancée. This was a sworn public servant realizing he was mere hours away from handing a massive, loaded weapon to a corporate predator. He was standing directly next to men who were actively willing to trade human lives for a clean public image and a massive federal payout. Before Mercer and I could finalize our countermeasure for the evening, the heavy library door clicked open. My parents walked slowly into the room. They looked entirely shattered. The pristine, upper-class arrogance they had worn like impenetrable armor the previous night had completely dissolved into dust. Elaine Crosby's hands were trembling violently against her sides. Thomas Crosby looked like a man who had aged 10 full years in a single, sleepless night. They had finally cracked under the immense weight of their own complicity. "We need to tell you the entire truth, Sarah," my father said, his voice cracking with a heavy, suffocating shame. He refused to look at the senator. He looked strictly at me, his eyes wide and desperate. "Grant came to us over a year ago," my mother confessed, tears finally spilling over her carefully applied makeup, leaving dark streaks down her cheeks. "Right after you were officially cleared by the federal committee. He sat in our living room and told us that your reputation was permanently toxic in the high-end corporate world. He insisted that if you ever appeared in rooms with powerful people, if anyone ever connected his name to yours, the major developers would permanently blacklist his firm. He aggressively convinced us that you were a massive, unpredictable liability to his entire future. We let him hide you. We agreed to his horrible rules because we wanted him to succeed so badly. We deliberately chose his ambition over our own daughter." Hearing them finally admit the true depth of their betrayal was a strange, incredibly hollow victory. They had not just passively accepted my insulting seating arrangement at the dinner, they had actively participated in my erasure for months, entirely manipulated by Grant's calculated fear-mongering. They had willingly traded my dignity for his corner office. I looked at my weeping mother and my broken father. I did not offer them forgiveness, and I did not offer them comfort. The psychological damage they had inflicted was far too deep and far too precise to be healed by a quick apology in a borrowed library. "I am staying," I told them, turning my back on their tears. My voice vibrated with absolute, undeniable certainty. I turned back to Senator Mercer. I made my exact principles incredibly clear. I was not going to the evening gala to destroy my brother's engagement out of spite. Amelia was already handling the death of her relationship on her own formidable terms. I was not going to humiliate my parents further or cause a dramatic, screaming family scene in front of the press. I was going because Lowell Pike and Grant Crosby were actively asking for the right to lead the public, and they were preparing to build that leadership on a deadly, fragile lie. I was going to ensure that not a single ounce of concrete was ever poured under their corrupt supervision. The heavy grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 5 times. We had less than 2 hours before the massive doors to the ballroom officially opened. The pressure in the room was absolute, feeling exactly like a tightly coiled steel spring ready to violently snap. The glamorous gala was going to happen. The press cameras were going to roll, and the men who arrogantly thought they had successfully negotiated their survival were about to walk blindly into a devastating demolition. The historic ballroom of the Riverside Hotel in Savannah was a masterpiece of gilded architecture. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, blinding light over the sea of custom tuxedos and designer gowns. Waiters in immaculate white coats circulated with silver trays of champagne. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the quiet hum of immense political power. Grant stood at the center of the elevated stage, framed by heavy velvet curtains. He looked absolutely flawless. His tuxedo was tailored to a fraction of an inch, his hair perfectly styled, his smile radiating an expertly manufactured warmth. He gripped the edges of the mahogany podium, looking out over the crowd of journalists, state officials, and wealthy donors. "Tonight marks the beginning of a magnificent chapter," Grant projected into the microphone, his voice smooth and commanding. "Not only am I incredibly humbled to announce my formal engagement to the brilliant Amelia Mercer, but I am equally honored to declare that Calder Row Advisory will be joining Senator Mercer as the lead legal counsel for the new federal urban housing initiative." Polite applause began to ripple through the room. But before it could swell into an ovation, the sharp, amplified sound of a microphone being tapped echoed from the side of the stage. Amelia walked up the short flight of stairs. She wore a stunning midnight blue gown, but her posture was rigid, carrying the terrifying, absolute stillness of a gathering storm. She did not look at Grant. She walked directly to the podium and gently, firmly took the microphone from his hand. Grant's practiced smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face. "Thank you, Grant, for that beautiful introduction," Amelia said. Her voice was perfectly steady, lacking even a single trace of anger or sorrow. The absolute coldness of her tone was far more intimidating than any scream could ever be. "However, before we celebrate the future, we need to be completely honest about the past. There is a guest in this room who needs to be recognized, not as a stranger, and not as a distant family friend, but as someone who was intentionally erased so this exact moment could happen." The ballroom fell into a sudden, highly uncomfortable silence. The cameras at the back of the room subtly shifted their focus. "I would like to invite Sarah Crosby to the stage," Amelia announced. I stood up from a table near the front. I was not wearing a shimmering designer gown. I wore my simple, practical black dress. I kept my head high and my shoulders pulled back. I walked up the steps and stood directly beside Amelia. Grant stared at me, the color rapidly draining from his face, his jaw clenching so hard the muscles visibly jumped beneath his skin. Senator Warren Mercer immediately followed me onto the stage. He bypassed the podium and stood squarely in front of the flashing cameras. "As a public servant, my highest duty is to the safety and the truth of the people I represent," Mercer declared, his heavy voice booming through the speakers. "And the truth is, I can no longer support any initiative that includes individuals who actively bury public risks to protect their profit margins. I absolutely refuse to stand beside men who launch vicious, coordinated attacks against the honor of the very person who saved my family from a catastrophic disaster." A collective gasp ripped through the audience. Journalists immediately raised their audio recorders. At a table near the center, Lowell Pike's face turned a violent, dark shade of crimson. Mercer stepped back and gestured toward me. I did not need a piece of paper, and I did not need to launch into an emotional, tearful monologue. I simply approached the microphone and delivered the facts with the brutal, unforgiving precision of a senior structural field investigator. 18 months ago, the Halcyon Tower suffered a critical foundational failure, I stated clearly, looking directly out at the sea of wealthy faces. I issued the mandatory evacuation order exactly 12 minutes before the lower parking levels collapsed. In the immediate aftermath, an anonymous legal memo signed only with the initials G.C. was circulated to the review boards. It falsely painted me as an erratic, hysterical investigator in a deliberate attempt to destroy my credibility and bury the developer's criminal negligence. I turned my head slightly, locking eyes with my brother. He looked entirely paralyzed, completely stripped of his corporate armor. That memo, along with an internal corporate email advising the crisis management team to aggressively control the public narrative, was written by Grant Crosby. I continued. The room erupted into shocked whispers, but I raised my voice just enough to cut right through the noise. Furthermore, the newly leaked geotechnical data for the upcoming federal housing initiative shows the exact same pattern of corruption. The proposed building plans authorized by Vantage Meridian Holdings indicate a deliberate 30% reduction in required load-bearing steel, masked by falsified soil density reports. "That is an absolute slanderous lie," Lowell Pike shouted, jumping up from his chair, his heavy fist slamming onto the table. "You have absolutely no authority here. Those are fabricated documents from a disgruntled, unstable employee." Senator Mercer calmly stepped back to the microphone. "They are not fabricated, Lowell. And she is not alone." Mercer gestured toward the side doors. Two men in dark suits walked into the room, flanked by the senator's senior legal counsel. "I have two independent federal structural auditors currently reviewing the entire Vantage Meridian portfolio as we speak. Every single metric Sarah just listed matches their preliminary findings flawlessly." Pike opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer weight of the evidence crushed him instantly. He looked at the federal auditors, looked at the flashing cameras, and slowly sank back into his chair, a defeated, ruined man. The silence that followed was absolute. Amelia turned to face Grant. She did not shed a single tear. She did not raise her hand to strike him. She simply reached down to her left hand and smoothly slid the massive diamond ring off her finger. She placed it carefully on the wooden surface of the podium, the small metallic click echoing loudly through the microphone. "I cannot marry a man who views the erasure of his own sister and the violent distortion of the truth as simple situation management," Amelia said coldly. "We are completely done, Grant." Panic finally broke through Grant's paralysis. He looked desperately around the stage, realizing his entire empire was burning to the ground in real time. He looked down into the audience, his eyes frantically searching for the safety net that had always caught him. He locked eyes with our parents, sitting at a table near the front row. For his entire life, Thomas and Elaine Crosby had protected him, justified his arrogance, and sacrificed me to ensure his success. But sitting under the blinding, unforgiving lights of public accountability, the illusion shattered. They could not spin this. Grant silently begged them to intervene, to shout something, to defend his character. For the very first time in 35 years, they did not stand up for him. Elaine Crosby covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as she broke down into loud, uncontrollable sobs. She looked up at me standing on the stage, her face a mask of profound, agonizing regret. "I am so sorry, Sarah," she wept, her voice carrying over the quiet room. "I am so incredibly sorry." Beside her, my father slowly shook his head. "We knew the truth," Thomas admitted softly, looking at the floor, his voice broken. "We just chose the comfortable lie because it was easier than doing what was right." Grant stepped back from the podium, his breathing shallow and rapid. He was completely alone. He had traded his family, his integrity, and his soul for a seat at the table, and now the table had been violently flipped. He turned and walked quickly off the side of the stage, disappearing into the dark shadows of the backstage corridor. The room remained incredibly still. Senator Mercer turned to me, offering a deep, respectful nod. "Sarah," Mercer said, speaking clearly so every reporter in the room could hear. "In light of tonight's revelations, I am establishing a new, entirely independent oversight board for this urban housing program. We need someone who cannot be bought, someone who refuses to be intimidated by wealth or power. I want you to lead it." I looked out at the massive ballroom. I saw the cameras, the politicians, and the wealthy elite who had spent the last 2 days treating me like a disposable, inconvenient ghost. I took a slow, deep breath. "I accept your offer, Senator," I replied firmly. "On one strict, non-negotiable condition. Every single structural report, every geotechnical survey, and every safety audit will be published on a public, open-source database. No closed doors, no redacted memos. Nobody will ever be allowed to turn human safety into a public relations tool ever again. Mercer smiled genuinely. You have my absolute word. As I walked off the stage, I felt a profound, incredible lightness in my chest. My ultimate victory tonight was not witnessing the dramatic destruction of my brother's career, nor was it seeing a corrupt billionaire finally get caught in his own trap. Those were merely the consequences of the truth finally breaking the surface. My true victory was emotional. For the very first time in my entire life, I was standing directly in the center of a crowded, powerful room, and I did not need to ask a single person for permission to exist. I did not need to hide my rough edges, my practical shoes, or my loud, unyielding voice. I walked past the empty chair where Grant had been sitting, past the shattered remnants of my parents' fake perfection, and out the main double doors of the ballroom. I finally understood the fundamental rule of power and self-worth. Taking your rightful place at the main table is never about waiting for someone else to politely pull a velvet chair out for you. It is about having the courage to stop walking into any room that only accepts your presence when you are willing to completely disappear. Thank you so much to everyone for listening to this story today. Please drop a comment below, letting us know where in the world you are tuning in from, so we can interact and share our thoughts together. And do not forget to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.